Good morning. It's just past 7 o'clock, and we are following a story that has been building for years and finally broke on a single night. For decades now, the drug war along the U.S.-Mexico border has been one of those headlines that never really goes away. Kingpins captured, kingpins escaping, extradition requests filed and filed again, and always the same frustrating pattern. The most wanted men in the hemisphere staying comfortably on the Mexican side of the line. That was the story. That was what everyone had come to expect. And then, in one movement on the night of February 27th, 2025, that entire pattern was broken. 29 men. Not one. Not a symbolic handful. 29 of the most significant figures in the history of Mexican organized crime, pulled from prisons scattered all across the country, put on an aircraft north of Mexico City, and flown into the custody of the United States. And here is the number that tells you just how extraordinary this was. Between 2019 and 2023, Mexico extradited an average of about 65 wanted suspects to the United States over the course of an entire year. On this one night, in a single coordinated operation, it handed over nearly half of that annual figure at once. Prosecutors and analysts used one word for it, and it was not an exaggeration: historic. And to understand why this landed the way it did, you have to understand who was on those planes. The name at the very top of the list is Rafael Caro Quintero. If you follow this world at all, you know that name. He was a founder of the old Guadalajara cartel, and to U.S. law enforcement, he represented a wound that had never closed: the 1985 kidnapping, torture, and murder of Drug Enforcement Administration agent Enrique Kiki Camarena. Camarena had been working undercover in Guadalajara, and his abduction in broad daylight, followed by weeks of agonizing uncertainty before his body was found, turned his case into one of the most painful chapters in the agency's history. For American agents, that killing defined a generation. Caro Quintero had once been sentenced to 40 years, and then, in 2013, a Mexican court overturned that sentence, and he simply walked free after 28 years behind bars. He went back to the FBI's 10 most wanted list, and for a long time, it looked like he might never answer for any of it. Now, at 72 years old, he was on a plane to New York, but he was not alone, and this is where the scale of it really comes into focus. Also transferred were the Trevino Morales brothers, Miguel and Omar, the men known as Z40 and Z42. They led the Zetas, the paramilitary organization that broke away from the Gulf Cartel and brought a level of violence to Mexico in the 2010s that shocked even a country that had seen a great deal. The Zetas had originally been formed by former members of Mexican military units who defected to work for the traffickers, and they carried that training into the drug trade, a background that helps explain the brutal, disciplined efficiency they became known for. Then, there was Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, El Viceroy, the former head of the Juarez cartel, brother of the man once nicknamed the Lord of the Skies. And the reach of this operation went right up to the present-day powers as well. Among those handed over were a security chief tied to the Chapitos faction of the Sinaloa cartel, and Antonio Oseguera Cervantes, the brother of El Mencho, the leader of the CJNG, one of the most powerful trafficking organizations operating today. Old empires and current ones, all moving in the same night. So the first question is the obvious one. Why now? Why, after decades of resisting exactly this kind of transfer, did Mexico suddenly do it, and do it at this scale? And the answer sits in a room in Washington. Because at the very moment these prisoners were being loaded on an aircraft, a delegation of top Mexican officials was in the United States Capitol, sitting across from the incoming administration's team. On the table was a threat with enormous consequences: a proposed 25% tariff on all Mexican imports. And you cannot separate the two events. This was not a routine legal procedure grinding through the courts. This was a demonstration, a show of security cooperation delivered at precisely the moment Mexico needed to prove something to Washington. That is the context in which 29 of its most notorious prisoners left the country in a single night. And notice the mechanism, because it matters. This was not framed as a normal extradition working its way through the appeals process. Mexican authorities described these 29 as being expelled from the country, using national security grounds rather than the slower, more traditional extradition route that Caro Quintero and others had used for years to fight and delay their transfer. In other words, Mexico found a faster door, and it walked all of them through at once. That distinction is part of why this caught so many people, including the men themselves, completely off guard. If you're following this story closely, take a second to subscribe so the next chapter doesn't pass you by. Now, where did they all go? Because handed to the United States is not one place. These 29 were distributed across roughly 8 American cities to face charges in federal districts around the country: drug trafficking, money laundering, weapons, and in the most personal cases, murder. Caro Quintero and several others were taken to New York to a federal court in Brooklyn. And there, one after another, these men who had operated for decades as untouchable figures stood in front of American judges. Caro Quintero pleaded not guilty to the charges connected to Camarina's killing. Others pleaded not guilty to their own array of trafficking counts. The men who had spent their careers making sure they never had to stand in an American courtroom were now doing exactly that. And here is where the story took a turn that even many observers didn't expect. Because when you bring in a defendant charged in connection with the murder of a federal agent, the question of the ultimate penalty comes up immediately. U.S. prosecutors did, in fact, spend months weighing whether to seek the death penalty against Caro Quintero. For a man accused in the killing that scarred the DEA, many assumed that was exactly where this was heading. But in early August of 2025, the U.S. Attorney General's office announced its decision. Prosecutors would not pursue capital punishment against Caro Quintero, nor against Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, nor against another major figure in U.S. custody. The cases would go forward, but not as death penalty cases. For a saga defined by the 1985 murder of an American agent, that was a significant and, to some, a surprising line to draw. So step back and look at what this whole episode actually represents, because it's bigger than any one of these names. For years, the story of the drug war was a story of impunity at the very top. The soldiers, the low-level operators, the couriers, they were arrested and prosecuted constantly. But the men who built the organizations, who ordered the killings, who moved the money, they seemed to exist above the reach of the very governments hunting them. Caro Quintero walking free in 2013 was almost a symbol of that entire problem. What happened on that February night was the deliberate, dramatic reversal of that image. It said that the men at the top could be moved, and moved all at once, when the political pressure was high enough. And that last point is the one worth holding on to, because it reveals what this really was. This was not simply a law enforcement victory. It was a moment where two very different worlds collided. The world of trafficking and violence that these 29 men represented, and the world of tariffs, trade delegations, and diplomatic leverage happening in Washington at the very same hour. The prisoners were the currency. Their transfer was the message. And it worked in the sense that it bought Mexico goodwill at a tense moment, while giving the United States something it had wanted for decades: Rafael Caro Quintero, the Trevino brothers, El Viceroy, and 24 others standing inside its own justice system at last. There are still open threads. These are cases, not convictions. Every one of these men has pleaded not guilty, and each of these prosecutions will now grind forward through the American courts, some of them for years. There are questions in Mexico, too, about the legal basis for expelling 29 of its own citizens in a single night without the usual process. Questions that legal scholars on both sides of the border are still working through. And there is the larger question that no transfer, however dramatic, can answer: whether removing the men at the top actually changes anything on the ground, in a business that has already survived the arrest, the death, and the extradition of one generation of leaders after another. But whatever comes next, the night of February 27th belongs in the record as something that had never happened before. 29 of the most wanted men in the hemisphere, kingpins, security chiefs, brothers of sitting cartel bosses, pulled from prisons across an entire country, put on planes, and delivered into the hands of the United States in the span of a few hours. They did not think this day would come. For decades, the pattern said it never would. And then, in a single night, 29 of them found out just how